And you might begin to wonder as you have this conversation, which Jesus have they been listening to and which Jesus have you been listening to? Because listening to someone properly normally means you can repeat their ideas rather than stating your own. Now, we're all in church, so we would, I imagine, would say, yes, we listen to Jesus. But I just want to look at Peter in this passage because he was very close to Jesus. Did he listen to Jesus? And in some sense, absolutely, yes, he did. And do keep your Bibles open. And if you could just flick back with me, we will be in chapter 17, but I want to look at a few verses in chapter 16. So chapter 16, verse 15. Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And in verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." We've had 16 chapters of Matthew so far, and when this happens, we think, yes, Peter, you've got it. You've understood who Jesus is. Peter is listening. But in another sense, he's really not listening. Look further down at verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Peter seemed to have been listening. He understood who Jesus was. Jesus, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. But when Jesus starts to explain what he's come to do, Peter shuts him down. "Never, Lord." It tells us he rebukes Jesus. Peter says to the Son of God, "You've got it wrong." He says, "Jesus, I will go with you on the Son of God stuff," but Peter had this idea that Jesus was here to get rid of the Romans, to create this earthly kingdom that the disciples would serve with him. Peter says, "Jesus, I'm with you on the Son of God stuff. I'm with you on the Messiah, the King. But this dying and rising again stuff, it's not going to happen. It's not part of my plan." Peter was very close to Jesus, but he wasn't listening. Jesus says, it's very harsh, isn't it? "Get behind me, Satan." Why does he use that word, Satan? Well, it's because Satan, right at the start of the Bible, his trick was to say, did God really say? Did God really say that? And Peter's doing the same to Jesus. "Jesus, you don't mean that. You're not going to die and rise again." Jesus says, "Peter, you've got human concerns, not God's concerns. You're not seeing the big picture." Verse 24. "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Jesus says to Peter, he says to us this morning, you need to think bigger. Being created, our existence is not about living in this world and having everything in this world. It's about the world to come. Verse 25 again, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it." In other words, there is glory to come. There is great glory in heaven. Don't trade that in for a good life now. He goes on, "What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" Look to the future. Don't build a kingdom here on earth. And then we get this strange verse in verse 28, and that tees up our passage. "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." I think he was referring to his death and his resurrection that's going to come at the end of Matthew's gospel. But the first fruits of that are going to be right in our passage. Jesus showing what his amazing kingdom looks like. Jesus showing his heavenly body to them. And that's why, it's chapter 17, verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took some who were standing there, Peter, James, and John, up a mountain by themselves. Now, Jesus, as I've said, he's just been saying to them, don't live for this world, live for that world. What do the disciples need to see? To know that that's not just pie in the sky, that that's not just a fairy tale to make people cope with life better. What do they need to see? They need to see that Jesus is the real deal. They need to see that there is a life to come, and then they will truly live for him in this world. And we will truly live for him in this world. And we should listen to him. And we're going to quickly see three reasons from this passage why we should listen to Jesus. Firstly, verses 1 and 2, his appearance. And I've been massively helped out by the drama because we all know the story now. Look at verse 2. There Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. In Exodus, the Old Testament, Moses, who's going to appear in our story, he went up a high mountain, and he would speak to God. And when he came down from the mountain, the Israelite people noticed that his face is shining. In fact, they don't just notice it, they're too scared to speak to him because his face is shining. And Moses has to wear a special veil to cover his face. Jesus here, if you like, is repeating that, except his face is shining not because he's reflecting God's glory, which is what Moses did, but because he is God, because he is the glorious one, and that is why he is shining. Imagine what that was like for the disciples, as we saw earlier, that they're going around with their friend, this carpenter from Nazareth. They go up on this mountain, and suddenly their friend, his clothes become as white as the light. Completely pure, not a blemish. Be a very good Daz advert, wouldn't it? This Jesus. But this is him in his glorious form. This is him in his heavenly form. This is God come to earth. And Peter remembers this. You don't need to turn there. I'll read it to you. In 2 Peter chapter 1, he starts telling us about what happens here. He says, we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We didn't make it up. We didn't write this clever story. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. Peter's saying, I was on a mountain with Jesus and I saw his majesty. I saw the glory pouring out of him. He's the real deal. You can trust what I'm saying. That's what Peter writes. For Peter, this event here tells him Jesus is Lord. He is God. And how often do we forget that our Jesus is like this? We can feel very alone sometimes. We can feel weak. And we forget that this is our powerful Jesus who is alive today and who is with us to the very end of the age. That's our Jesus, this shining, powerful one. We should listen to him because of his appearance. Do you listen to him? Secondly, we should listen to Jesus because of his attendants, who he hangs out with on this mountain. Verse 3. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Now, why are Moses and Elijah here? People have written great big books on why Moses and Elijah are here. And I think it's important that they're here because of the way that they died. Or rather, Elijah, he never died. The Old Testament tells us he was taken to heaven in a chariot. He didn't die. Moses did die, but we're told that his body was taken away by an angel. And this meant that the Jewish people saw Moses and Elijah, they called them the deathless ones. They're the figures in the Old Testament for them where They don't know where they went. So for these disciples who need to know that there's a day coming when those who follow Christ are given life, eternal life, here is proof. You were wondering where Moses and Elijah went? Well, here they are. Our God is a God of the living. Moses and Elijah are right here. Jesus is showing them, look, there is life after death. There is a resurrection day. Live for that future day. More than that, Moses and Elijah, they are speaking with Jesus. You speak with people you accept, who you agree. Here it's showing agreement. Moses and Elijah, they kind of represent everything that happened in the Old Testament in this passage. Now, the entire Old Testament is like a giant arrow pointing to Jesus. So what this is showing us, this mountain, is that Jesus has the entire authority of the Old Testament behind him. It's all pointing to him. He is speaking with Moses and Elijah. And that means that there's a very old idea that crops up again and again throughout church history, that the Old Testament is a different, angry God, and the New Testament is lovely, happy Jesus. But this passage is showing us, no, Jesus is in entire agreement with the Old Testament. It's all pointing to him. When we read the Old Testament, we're hearing from God. When we read the New Testament, we're hearing from God. So truly listening to Jesus will involve listening to his words, not coming up with our favorite ideas about him, not removing parts of the Bible that we don't agree with. No, it means listening to God, every one of his words. It's all in agreement. Moses, Elijah, Jesus, together. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of the story is Peter here. He doesn't really know what to do. Matthew's quite sympathetic to Peter here, but Mark is not as kind. In Mark 9:6, it reads, Peter did not know what to say. They were so frightened. So he's kind of scared out of his wits. I don't know if you get that when you get nervous and you just start saying anything. That's what Peter does here. He says, verse 4, he says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. I think Peter kind of thinks this is going to make a great story. And I want to keep this going. Let's build tents. Let's stay up here. And I think he's missed the point. He's trying to make a tent for Jesus. This is Jesus, remember, in his heavenly form, who comes from heaven, who has an eternal dwelling, not built by human hands. Peter wants to make him a tent. But I think the main point here is Peter's trying to prolong the glory of the moment. Remember, there's 9 disciples at the bottom of the mountain, but Peter's not worried about that. He says, let's stay here. This is glorious. I'm with the glorious ones. Let's stay on this mountain. He doesn't recognize that Jesus is showing him this is what the future holds. Heaven with me. Life to come. It's just a small picture. It's not the full point. And most of all, the notable thing is that Peter is still speaking rather than listening to Jesus. We should listen to Jesus because of who he's with. And third point, because of his Father's approval. Verse 5. While Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And this draws it all together. God the Father speaks from a bright cloud, and it's whilst, do you see the language there? While Peter's still speaking, Peter literally is interrupted by the God of the universe. That would be a terrifying moment for you. He's mumbling about, let's make some tents, and God interrupts him. Peter, stop talking. Stop telling Jesus what to do, how to rule. He is my Son. He is God. I am well pleased with him. Stop talking and listen. And when the disciples heard this, verse 6, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. They just fall straight down. And you and I would too. If we heard God speak to us from a cloud, this is how we would react. When God speaks, other voices fall silent because he is so powerful. He is so holy. He is so other. But the amazing thing is, despite him being so wonderful, so beyond us, look at the very next verse in verse 7. But Jesus came and touched them. These terrified disciples who feel so small, who feel so sinful, who feel so weak before this enormous God, but Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Jesus is this glorious God, and yet he's come down to us as fully man. And we can know God because he's made him known to us. He doesn't just say transcendent in the air. He has come to know his people. So gentle. Don't be afraid. I'm here to help you. You just need to listen to me. That's what Jesus is saying. It's a final point. Listen to what exactly? What specifically are we meant to be listening to? And of course, all of Jesus' words, the whole Bible, we should be following and listening to. That is obvious. But what causes God the Father here to make a point to say, listen to him? Well, we saw earlier that Peter was guilty of not listening to Jesus about his death and his resurrection. That's what Peter was guilty of. Jesus was saying, I need to die. I need to rise again because of human sin. I've got to pay the price. And Peter rebukes him. Never, Lord. And verses 9 to 13, I think they support this as well. Verse 9, as they are coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And we see this a lot from Jesus in the Gospels where he says, don't tell anyone. And we think, why not? Jesus, if you tell people about you shining on this mountain, you'll get loads of followers. Why not tell everyone? Well, I think it's because this transfiguration, as glorious as it is, it's not the reason Jesus came to earth. He's told us the reason he came to earth. He came to die and rise again. It was never about glory on earth for a few short years. He didn't want to be put on a human throne. He was dying and rising again to claim the eternal throne. We know at the end of Matthew's gospel, when the victory was won, when he had done what he came to do, then he says, famously, go and make disciples of all nations. Now that the job is done, go and tell everyone. That's why he came. Verses 10 to 13 they can be confusing, but I think they indicate to us perhaps the disciples are still not listening closely. Verse 10, they asked him, why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? This is a question that the Pharisees have been saying about Jesus. There's a prophecy in Malachi, the end of the Old Testament, that says Elijah's going to come and then the Messiah will come. And the Pharisees have been saying, well, where's Elijah? Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah. We haven't seen Elijah. And now the disciples, they've been on this mountain and now they've seen Elijah, but they've seen Elijah after Jesus, so they're very confused. And Jesus says to them, Elijah has come, and by that he means John the Baptist, and he was rejected, and now I am rejected. He says, in the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And then verse 13, I don't know if this is ironic from Matthew, says the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. They understood about John the Baptist, but they haven't said anything about him saying he's going to suffer and die. They don't respond to that at all. Seems perhaps they're still not listening. And we know from the Gospels they don't ever fully get it until Jesus has risen. It never quite clicks. But are you listening to Jesus this morning? Because what Jesus wants us to see from these chapters is that his mission to earth is cross-centered, that his entire plan for himself and for humanity meets its climax on the cross. Remember Peter with his human concerns? He wanted his plan on earth to happen. He wanted Jesus to achieve what he wanted. Well, do you see yourself there? How quickly I slip into putting my human concerns before God, to have my life on this earth, to gain the whole world in my own way. What is it about this life that entices you? Maybe you'd say, I am looking forward to heaven, but deep down there's stuff here that's what I really want. If I can just get that right job and be secure financially, then life will be great. That's what it's all about. If I could just convince that person to go out with me, then I'd truly be happy. I'd feel fulfilled in this earth. Or if all my children were well behaved and enjoying church, then I'd feel secure. Then I'd be happy to trust God. If people just recognize my gifts, if they recognize what I could do, then I'd really be able to make my mark on this world. If I was just a little bit more like that person, they seem to have it so sorted, and then life would be worth living. We make these small things the meaning of our lives so often. What is it for you? These things, these empty things, they're a bid to have our best lives in this world and not look to the future world. We can start to feel like Jesus has promised us a great earthly life rather than that promise of the future kingdom. And then we can get bitter about it. God, why haven't you delivered this stuff that I want? We can start to feel resentful to Jesus and think, Jesus, look, I've got plans for this world. I've got things that I want to do here. I've got really good ideas. Jesus, help me to accumulate this stuff. And we're reminded of 16 verse 26 again. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? As Christians, we're called to die to ourselves in this world, to take up our cross and follow him. We lose our life in this world for Christ. But is that just a very bleak message this Sunday morning, that we have a miserable life here and then glory to come? I don't think this is an unloving God who asks us to sacrifice here. He is a wonderfully loving God who knows that there is better by far to come. I've said already this morning, I love Test cricket. So one of my heroes is C.T. Studd. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a brilliant cricketer. He played for England at the end of the 19th century. That would be my absolute dream. But then he suddenly gave up cricket to start preaching around the country, raise money for mission work, and eventually went on mission himself. And people at the time were saying, you're crazy. You've got this dream job. They got paid very well, the cricketers at that time as well. You've got this dream job. You're the best player for England. What are you doing giving that up? Listen to what he said. I knew that cricket would not last, and honour would not last, and nothing in this world would last. But it was worthwhile living for the world to come. And then he went and he did that mission work, and his motto became, if Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him. C.T. Studd was listening to Jesus in this passage. He trusted in the future. And I believe that's why these two chapters are next to each other in Matthew's gospel, because Jesus is saying, he's calling us to trust in the cross and the resurrection and follow the example of the cross. He knows it's going to be hard, but he's showing us in his glorious appearance, there's a certain future. Follow me, it will be so worth it. Jesus wants us to focus on the cross, and this is the final thing we're going to look at. He's headed to another mountain, and instead of standing between two Old Testament heroes, Moses and Elijah, he's going to be crucified between two criminals, one on either side. And instead of being in his glorious majesty, He's going to be stripped and humiliated. And instead of his followers, his closest followers, bowing to the ground before him, he's going to be mocked and abandoned and betrayed. Because that's what he came for. It's all about the cross. It's everything. Without the cross, we have nothing to save us from our sin and God's righteous anger towards it. Jesus knows that. But when he paid for our sin on the cross, his blood is all the protection we could ever need. And if we trust in Jesus, God looks on us and he sees in us the perfection of his Son. And with his Son, we know he is well pleased. So the world is very quick to speak about God. Whether that's TV atheists saying that if they met God, they give him a piece of their mind. Whether that's the average person on the street who just sees God as someone to give them earthly blessings. Whether that's even the person who goes to church but wants to use God's words to push their own agenda. Lots of people speaking about God. And they can often push the cross out the way and it's seen as backwards or uncivilized. Don't talk to me about sin and judgment and sacrifice. But Jesus is very clear. That's why I came. He's very clear that we are sinful before him. He's very clear that we need our sin paid for and that he came to do that. And every voice, human voice, will fall silent when Jesus returns. So now is the time to listen to him. We need to listen to Jesus. We need to reflect on who he is, who he says he is. We need to listen to what he talks about, not what we want to talk about. We need to listen to what he says about our condition, not what we think. We need to listen to what he thinks we need to do about it. And we can be so thankful for what he has done about it on the cross. Let me close with those words from verse 7. Get up. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Jesus is the only voice you need to listen to. And he's promised such a wonderful future. So are you listening to him this morning? Let's pray.